In the crowded hallways of Northwood High, he moved like a whisper. Most days, he was just part of the background, a quiet figure in a worn hoodie who kept his head down and his books close to his chest. People would bump into him in the rush between classes, mutter a quick sorry without really seeing his face, and move on. He wasn't bullied or ignored in a mean way, he was just invisible. It was a cloak he had learned to wear comfortably, a shield that kept the world at a safe distance. But this quiet exterior held a secret, a storm of sound and emotion that no one at school had ever guessed. His real voice wasn't spoken, it was played. His sanctuary was a forgotten room in the basement of the school, tucked away behind the boiler room where the air was always a little warm and smelled of old wood and dust. Inside sat an old upright piano, its finish cracked in a few places and some of the ivories on the keys yellowed with age. It was out of tune, but to him, it was perfect. This was where the invisible boy became a king. During his lunch break, or for a few precious minutes after the last bell, he would slip away, close the heavy door, and let his fingers find the keys. The moment his fingers touched the cool ivory, the world outside the door disappeared. The loneliness of the hallways, the feeling of being an outsider, the weight of unspoken words, it all melted away into the music. He didn't just play notes, he told stories. His music was a blend of everything he was. There was the structure and discipline of the classical composers he'd studied from library books, the precise and powerful chords that echoed with a kind of intellectual strength. But woven into that structure was something else, something deeper and more soulful. It was the sound of his grandmother's small church on Sunday mornings, the swell of the organ, the clapping of hands, the voices raised in joy and sorrow. It was the blues he heard drifting from open windows in his neighborhood, the sound of struggle and resilience. He mixed them all together into something that was entirely his own. It was a conversation between his past and his future, a river of sound that could be calm and reflective one moment, and a rushing, powerful flood the next. He had been playing for as long as he could remember, starting on a cheap keyboard his mother had bought him from a second-hand store. She saw the spark in him when he was just a little boy, how he could hear a song once and pluck out the melody on his toy piano. She worked extra hours to afford lessons with a strict old woman who taught him to read music and respect the craft. But after she passed away, the lessons stopped, and the piano became his only confidant. It was where he talked to her, where he poured out his anger and his grief, and where he eventually found a way to feel her presence again, not in sadness, but in the beauty of the music they both loved. For years, he kept this part of himself hidden. Sharing it felt like baring his soul, and the world had already taught him that being different could be a painful thing. But this year, something felt different. A small flyer taped to a bulletin board caught his eye, Northwood High Annual Talent Showcase. He'd seen it every year, always walking past with a quick glance and a shake of his head. Not this time. This time, he stared at the colorful paper, the words "be heard," "be seen," jumping out at him. A quiet voice inside him, one that was getting louder every day, whispered that it was time. Time to stop hiding in the basement. Time to let the whisper become a roar. The school's principal was a man who believed in order. He walked the halls with a rigid posture and a stern gaze, his shoes always shining brightly under the fluorescent lights. He loved the school's traditions, the morning announcements, the sports rallies, the predictable, polished performances at the talent show. He often spoke about Northwood pride, which to him meant fitting a certain mold, excelling in conventional ways. He was the master of ceremonies for the showcase every year, and his introductions were always dry and formal. He appreciated a good violin solo or a well-rehearsed monologue, but he had little patience for anything he considered messy or unrefined. He valued control, and the kind of music the young man played in the basement was anything but controlled. It was wild, it was free, and it was full of a raw emotion that the principal would likely find deeply unsettling. With a deep breath that felt both terrifying and exhilarating, the boy signed his name to the sign-up sheet under the flyer. Now, the work began. Every afternoon, he would stay late in the basement, practicing the piece he had been crafting in his mind for months. It was his story, from beginning to end. It started with a simple, lonely melody, like a single voice calling out in the dark. Then, it grew, adding layers of complexity and harmony, as if that voice had found others to sing with. It had moments of conflict, where fast, aggressive chords battled against a more hopeful tune. And it had a finale, a triumphant and powerful crescendo that felt like breaking through a wall into the sunlight. As he played, the old piano in the dusty room seemed to come alive, its worn wood vibrating with the force of his passion. He was no longer just practicing, he was preparing to finally introduce his true self to the world. He didn't know if they would listen, or if they would understand, but he knew he had to try. The quiet prodigy was ready to step into the light. The night of the talent show arrived with a buzz of nervous energy that filled the school auditorium. The air smelled of floor wax and the faint, buttery scent of popcorn from a machine in the lobby. Parents found their seats in the folding chairs, many with their phones already out, ready to record. Students gathered in loud, excited clusters near the back, their whispers and laughter bouncing off the high ceilings. On stage, the heavy velvet curtains were pulled back, revealing a single, lonely spotlight aimed at a grand piano that gleamed under the lights like a black pearl. The show began, and one by one, the acts performed. There was a girl from the cheerleading squad who sang a popular pop song, her voice pleasant but a little shaky. A couple of boys did a comedy skit that got some easy laughs. A boy from the orchestra played a flawless, but somewhat robotic, violin solo. They were all safe, predictable, and exactly what the principal expected. He sat at a small table to the side of the stage, tapping his pen on a clipboard, looking pleased with the orderly procession of Northwood pride. Then, a voice over the speaker system announced the next performer. And now, please welcome to the stage. The name echoed in the hall, and a quiet murmur went through the crowd. Many people looked around, not recognizing the name. The quiet boy from the hallways was a stranger to most of them. He walked out from the wings, and the journey to the piano felt like a mile long. The single spotlight hit him, and for a second, he was blinded by the light. He could see the silhouettes of hundreds of faces, a dark, endless sea of eyes all turned on him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, and his palms felt sweaty. He gave a small, almost invisible nod to the audience and sat down on the bench. The cool, smooth feel of the piano keys under his fingers was the only familiar thing in this terrifying new world. He took a deep, shaky breath, closed his eyes, and let his hands find their home. He began to play. The first few notes were soft, a little hesitant, like a question being asked into the silence. But then, something shifted. The music took over, and his fingers started to move with a confidence that his body didn't have. The quiet melody from the beginning began to grow, weaving in complex harmonies and soulful chords that seemed to come from a place much deeper than just his hands. It was the story he had been practicing, the story of him. The audience, which had been full of restless whispers and shuffling feet, grew still. The chatter died down completely. People leaned forward in their seats. They weren't just hearing a song, they were feeling something. They could hear the loneliness in the quiet parts, and they could feel the struggle and the hope in the powerful, swelling crescendos. The music was raw and honest and beautiful, and it filled every corner of the vast room. He was lost in it, completely absorbed in the world he was creating with the keys. His eyes were still closed, his body swaying slightly with the rhythm. He was building towards the most powerful part of the piece, the moment where the conflict resolved into a triumphant, joyful melody. The notes grew louder, faster, more intense, a rushing river of sound heading towards a waterfall. Just as he reached the peak, a sharp, metallic click cut through the music. It was the sound of a microphone being turned on. The principal had walked onto the stage and was now standing at the podium, a look of mild annoyance on his face. The boy's hands froze on the keys, the beautiful melody dying in mid-air. The sudden, jarring silence was even louder than the music had been. The principal leaned into the microphone, a small, tight smile on his lips. "All right, son, that's quite enough of that enthusiastic banging," he said, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that was clear to everyone. A few people in the audience let out nervous, uncomfortable titters, unsure of how to react. "Why don't you save some energy for after the show? Let's give him a hand for trying." He started a slow, mocking clap that only a few people hesitantly joined. The boy sat frozen at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys. A hot wave of shame washed over him, so intense it felt like a physical burn. His face was on fire. The magic was gone, the beautiful world he had built shattered into a million pieces. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, but now they weren't eyes of appreciation, they were eyes of pity. He felt small, exposed, and foolish. He had dared to share his soul, and the person in charge of the school had just called it noise. The principal gave a satisfied nod, as if he had just restored order to a chaotic situation, and turned to walk off the stage, leaving the boy alone in the crushing silence and the harsh, unforgiving spotlight. For a long, terrible moment, the world shrank to the size of the single, harsh spotlight. The boy sat frozen at the piano, the echoes of the principal's cruel words bouncing around in his head. Enthusiastic banging. The phrase was a poison, seeping into the pride he had so carefully built. The music, his beautiful, personal story, had been reduced to a joke. A hot, prickling shame crawled up his neck and settled on his cheeks. He could feel the eyes of every single person in the auditorium on him, their gazes heavy with a mixture of pity and second-hand embarrassment. All he wanted to do was stand up, walk off the stage, and disappear forever. He wanted to go back to the dusty basement room where his music was safe, where it was just for him. His hands, which had been dancing with such life just moments before, now felt like dead weights hovering over the keys. He looked down at them, at the familiar patterns of the ivory and ebony. This piano was his friend, his voice. It was the place where he spoke of things he could never say out loud. The principal hadn't just mocked him, he had tried to silence his voice. A new feeling began to bubble up from deep inside him, pushing back against the shame. It started as a small, hot spark in his chest and quickly grew into a quiet, steady fire. It wasn't the wild, desperate anger of a tantrum. It was something harder, something colder. It was the resolve of someone who had been pushed too far. He slowly lifted his head. The principal was already halfway back to his seat, a self-satisfied little smirk on his face, believing he had restored order. He hadn't even looked back. The boy's gaze didn't follow him. Instead, he looked out at the dark sea of faces, but he wasn't really seeing them anymore. He was seeing his grandmother's smile, hearing her voice telling him that his gift was a light. He was seeing the pages of the old, tattered music books he'd studied for hours. He was remembering the promise he made to himself to be heard. The shame was still there, a dull ache in the background, but it was no longer in charge. The fire was. He took a deep, slow breath, the kind you take before diving into cold water. And then, his fingers moved. But they didn't return to the soulful, personal melody he had been playing. Instead, they found the opening notes of a different song entirely. It was a piece he knew by heart, a technically brilliant and famously aggressive classical composition. The first few notes were sharp, precise, and cut through the heavy silence of the room like shards of glass. They were not a question, they were a statement. A declaration. The principal, who had just settled into his chair, froze. His head snapped back towards the stage, his expression one of confusion. The sound that was coming from the piano was not the banging he had dismissed. It was something else entirely. It was controlled, powerful, and utterly mesmerizing. The boy's fingers, which had seemed so clumsy and defeated just a moment ago, were now flying across the keys with a speed and precision that was almost superhuman. The music that erupted was a thunderstorm. It was a galloping army of notes, a cascade of sound that was both beautiful and terrifying. It was a sonic argument, a rebuttal to every condescending word the principal had spoken. Where his first piece had been a river of emotion, this was a tidal wave. It was complex, layered, and demanded your full attention. There was no room for pity or awkwardness now. There was only the music. The entire auditorium was transfixed. Students who had been slumping in their seats sat bolt upright. Parents who had been checking their phones lowered them, their mouths slightly agape. Teachers whispered to each other, their eyes wide with disbelief. The boy who had been invisible was now impossible to ignore. He was no longer just a student at a talent show, he was a force of nature on that stage. His body swayed with the music, his eyes closed in concentration, completely lost in the storm he was creating. He was pouring all of his hurt, all of his anger, and all of his defiant pride into every single note. Principal Harrison stood frozen by the side of the stage, his face pale. The smirk was long gone, replaced by a look of utter shock. He was a man who valued control and order, and what was happening on that stage was the complete opposite. It was a raw, chaotic, and brilliant display of talent that was so far beyond his understanding it was shattering his worldview. He had tried to put a young man in his place, and instead, the young man had just shown everyone the true meaning of excellence. The authority he thought he had was vaporizing in the heat of the music, leaving him looking small and foolish. The piece built to a frantic, breathtaking crescendo. The sound was so loud, so full of passion and fury, that it seemed to make the very air in the room vibrate. It was the sound of a soul refusing to be broken, a voice roaring back to life after being silenced. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The boy's hands came down on the final chords with a force that seemed to shake the foundations of the building, and then there was silence. A profound, breathless, absolute silence that hung in the air like a sacred vow. The whole school was frozen, not in shame, but in pure, unadulterated awe. They had just witnessed something they would never forget. The final chord of the furious piece seemed to hang in the air, a solid thing vibrating through the floorboards and up into the seats. For a full 5 seconds, the auditorium was locked in a state of pure, unbroken silence. It wasn't the awkward or polite silence that follows a mediocre performance. This was different. It was a sacred, heavy quiet, the kind that falls over a crowd when they have just witnessed something extraordinary, something that has stolen the breath right out of their lungs. The only sound was the faint hum of the stage lights and the boy's own ragged breathing, his chest heaving with the effort of the performance. He sat at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, his fingers trembling slightly. A high-pitched ringing had started in his ears, a common side effect of such intense concentration. He slowly opened his eyes, which he had squeezed shut during the final, thunderous passage. The single spotlight was still blinding, but beyond it, the dark shapes of the audience were no longer just a faceless mass. He could feel them. He could feel their collective shock, their confusion, their awe. He had no idea what would happen next. Part of him was terrified that they would start laughing, that the principal had been right all along and he had just made a complete fool of himself. Principal Harrison, who had been frozen by the side of the stage, was the first to move. He took a hesitant step forward, his clipboard held loosely in his hand like a shield. He opened his mouth, probably to say something to regain control of the situation, to dismiss the performance as a strange outburst and move on to the next act. But no sound came out. The power in the room had shifted so completely that his voice, the very symbol of his authority, had abandoned him. And then, it happened. From the third row, a sharp, distinct clap broke the silence. It was a single, confident sound, not a hesitant patter. It was the music teacher, a woman who had spent her life trying to get students to feel music, not just play it. She was on her feet, her face illuminated by the stage lights, a look of fierce, proud joy on her face as she clapped again, louder this time. That first clap was like a spark in a dry forest. Another person stood up near the aisle, a father who had been dragged to the show by his daughter. He joined in, his clapping steady and strong. Then a group of students in the back, who had been whispering and on their phones just minutes before, rose to their feet as one. The sound began to grow, a rolling wave of appreciation that started small and quickly gained momentum. It wasn't just polite applause anymore. It was a roar. A deafening, cathartic, and joyous noise that seemed to shake the very walls of the auditorium. People were on their feet all over the room, clapping, cheering, whistling. It was an explosion of sound, a tidal wave of emotion that completely washed away the tension and the cruelty of the moments before. The applause was not just for the music, it was for the courage. It was a standing ovation for the boy who had been knocked down and had responded not with words, but with a truth so powerful it could not be denied. The boy on the stage watched this happen with a sense of disbelief. The wall of sound hit him, and for a moment, he couldn't process it. He saw faces smiling, people shouting bravo. Tears in the eyes of some of the teachers. He saw the principal, a small, pale figure now standing awkwardly by the curtain, completely ignored by the crowd he had tried to control. The man's authority had evaporated, leaving him looking small and lost in the glow of the boy's triumph. A single, hot tear escaped from the corner of the boy's eye and traced a path down his cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness or shame. It was a tear of release, of vindication. It was the physical manifestation of a weight being lifted, a burden he hadn't even realized he was carrying. All the years of feeling invisible, of hiding his talent, of being afraid of not fitting in it all washed away in that thunderous roar. Slowly, he pushed the piano bench back and stood up. The moment he rose to his full height, the applause seemed to get even louder. He was no longer a hunched, vulnerable figure. He stood tall, his shoulders back, a quiet strength radiating from him. He looked out at the sea of faces, at the hundreds of people on their feet, all for him. He didn't wave or take a theatrical bow. That wasn't who he was. Instead, he just gave a small, slow nod of gratitude. It was a simple gesture, but it felt more profound than any speech. It said, "Thank you. I see you. And you see me." He turned and walked off the stage, his steps sure and steady this time. The cheers followed him into the wings, a warm, embracing sound that chased away the last of the shadows. Backstage, a few other performers stared at him with wide, worshipful eyes. A stagehand gave him a thumbs up and a bottle of water. He had walked onto that stage a quiet, invisible boy, an object of pity. He walked off it a hero. The whole school had frozen in the face of his talent, and in their thought, they had given him a standing ovation that would echo in the hallways of Northwood High for a very long time. The roar of the crowd followed him into the wings, a warm, living thing that seemed to push away the last of the cold fear that had been his companion for so long. Backstage, the world felt different. The other performers, who had been nervous and competitive just an hour ago, now looked at him with a kind of reverence. A girl with a guitar just stared, her mouth slightly open. A boy who had done a magic trick earlier gave him a clumsy thumbs up. He wasn't the invisible kid anymore. In the space of 10 minutes, he had become a legend. A stagehand he didn't know handed him a bottle of water with a nod of pure respect. He took it, his hands still trembling, and drank deeply. He didn't go back into the auditorium. He couldn't face the crowd, not yet. He slipped out a side door and into the cool night air, the sound of the applause still echoing in his ears. He walked home not in his usual slumped, invisible way, but with a straighter back, his head up. The world seemed sharper, more colorful. The street lights didn't just illuminate the sidewalk, they seemed to be shining just for him. The next morning at school, everything had changed. As he walked through the crowded hallways, the sea of students seemed to part for him. But this time, it wasn't because they didn't see him. It was because they did. People he had never spoken to smiled at him, gave him small nods of encouragement. "That was amazing," someone whispered as he passed by. "You were incredible," another person said. The whispers weren't about him being weird or quiet, they were whispers of awe. He sat down in his first class, and the teacher, a stern woman who rarely looked up from her book, paused and gave him a warm, genuine smile. The shame from the night before had been completely burned away by the fire of his performance and the warmth of the school's response. During lunch, a friend he usually sat with in silence was almost bouncing with excitement. "Dude, you have to see this," he said, pulling out his phone. On the screen was a video. It was shaky, filmed from the back of the auditorium, but the audio was surprisingly clear. It was him. It was the moment the principal cut him off, and then the moment he began to play again. He watched himself, a small figure under the bright light, his fingers flying across the keys. He could feel the raw emotion of the performance all over again. "It's everywhere," his friend said, scrolling through comments. "Thousands of them. This kid is a genius. The principal is a bully. That's how you respond to hate." The video had been uploaded late last night, and it had already been shared hundreds of thousands of times. It was like a wildfire, and he was at the very center of it. The consequences for the principal were swift and decisive. The video hadn't just been seen by students, it had been seen by parents, by local news, and by the school board. By the time the principal arrived at school the next day, his office was already filled with angry emails and phone calls. An emergency meeting was called. The story was no longer just about a talent show, it had become a symbol of something much bigger, a conversation about respect, about prejudice, and about the abuse of power. 2 days later, an announcement was made. The principal had been placed on administrative leave, and by the end of the week, he had resigned. The school didn't just move on, it was forced to look at itself. New assemblies were planned to talk about diversity and kindness. The talent show, once a platform for safe and predictable acts, was reimagined as a true celebration of student expression, in all its messy, beautiful forms. For the boy, the changes were even more personal. The phone in his mother's small apartment, which used to ring so rarely, began to ring off the hook. A local news station wanted to do an interview. A music professor from a nearby university, who had seen the video, wanted to meet him. Then came the letters. Not emails, but actual, formal letters with fancy logos on the envelopes. They were from music conservatories, schools he had only ever dreamed of, schools he had seen in movies. They were offering him scholarships, inviting him to audition, telling him that a place was waiting for him. The dusty basement piano had opened a door to a world he never thought was possible. Months later, he found himself sitting on a bench in a concert hall that was 1,000 times bigger than his school auditorium. The piano in front of him wasn't the old, cracked upright in the basement, it was a gleaming, perfect grand piano. The seats in front of him were filled with people, but this time, they weren't just classmates and parents. They were critics and musicians and people who had traveled just to hear him play. He was no longer a whisper, he was a voice that was being heard across the city. He looked out at the expectant faces, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't play the angry, defiant piece from that night. He didn't play the lonely, soulful melody he had first planned. He played something new. It was a melody that was complex and beautiful, a song that held the memory of the sadness but was filled with the brightness of hope. It was the sound of a journey, from a forgotten room in a basement to a grand stage in the light. It was the new melody of his life, and as the music filled the vast hall, he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that this was just the beginning.